So this is book 4 of an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations by Adam Smith, published in 1776. He's a very good writer. Adam Smith is a very good writer, like Ben Franklin. Easier to understand than people born 100 years later. So let me begin. Introduction to book 4. So book 4 is of systems of political economy. So I think that's like political systems, kind of like capitalism, communism, I think. So introduction. Political economy, considered as a branch of the science of a statesman or legislator, proposes two distinct objects. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves. Okay, that's the first one. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services. It proposes, so a system of political economy proposes to enrich both the people and the sovereign. The different progress of, so new paragraph, the different progress of opulence in different ages and nations has given occasion to two different systems of political economy with regard to enriching the people. The one, or the first, may be called the system of commerce, the other that of agriculture. I shall endeavor to explain both as fully and distinctly as I can, and shall begin with the system of commerce. It is the modern system, and is best understood in our own country and in our own times. And he's writing, I think, in England. So that is what he means by our own country. Oh no, my pencil is out of lead. I have to get a pencil so I can highlight stuff. So I would say that introduction, it was just those two paragraphs, the introduction, and now it's going to begin chapter 1. But I think it does a pretty good job of explaining what you're going to get out of this book, book 4. So put a big exclamation point next to this thing. Oh, this pencil looks like it's going to scratch up. Alright, I want to use a different pencil because this one looks like it's too strong. Alright, so I think the main thing, the main idea is two distinct objects. And there's 1, 2. And then at the end of the first paragraph, it restates the main idea that political economy proposes to enrich both the people and the sovereign. That's the main idea restated. Okay, and then the second paragraph in the introduction, two different And then he gives kind of like the main idea of book 4. Okay, so chapter 1. Maybe I should start a new, screw it, it's going to take too much time. So chapter 1, of the principle of the commercial or mercantile system. So he's just explaining what that system is all about. That wealth consists in money or in gold and silver is a popular notion which naturally arises from the double function of money as the instrument of commerce and as the measure of value. Let me read that again. So there is a popular notion that wealth consists in money or in gold and silver. And he says that that notion, that popular notion, it naturally arises from the fact that money is both the instrument of commerce and the measure of value. Well, what would it mean for those two things to be separated? I have often, a lot of people talk about how money isn't the only measure of wealth. People often say that, friendships can be a source of wealth. All kinds of relationships. Your health can be a source of wealth, and so that's a common thought. But what does he mean here by the double function of money as first as the instrument of commerce, and second as the measure of value? Well, okay, I think he goes on to kind of explain himself a little bit. So to continue, in consequence of its being the instrument of commerce, when we have money, we can more readily obtain whatever else we have occasion for than by means of any other commodity. The great affair, we always find, is to get money. So I think he's saying, when he says the great affair, I think he means the real issue, the real trouble, is to get money. When that is obtained, once you have money, there is no difficulty in making any subsequent purchase. I see. In consequence of its being the measure of value, so he's kind of like discussing two different things. So he's got a main idea, and he kind of splits off. In consequence of its being the measure of value, we estimate that of all other commodities by the quantity of money which they will exchange for. We say of a rich man that he is worth a great deal, and of a poor man he is worth very little money. A frugal man, or a man eager to be rich, is said to love money, and a careless, a generous, or a profuse man is said to be indifferent about money. Okay. Not sure where he's going with this. Well, he started with the idea, with this saying that the idea that wealth consists in money is natural because money is a measure of value. Okay, so to continue at the end, to grow rich is to get money, and wealth and money, in short, are, in common language, considered in every respect synonymous. Wealth and money, in short, wealth and money are considered in every respect synonymous. Okay. Don't know where he's going with this, but let's see. So a new paragraph. A rich country, in the same manner as a rich man, is supposed to be a country abounding in money. and to heap up gold and silver in any country is supposed to be the readiest way to enrich it. For some time after the discovery of America, the first inquiry of the Spaniards when they arrived upon an unknown coast used to be if there was any gold or silver to be found in the neighborhood. Wow, I mean, this reads so like such a modern. This reads like something. The ideas he's saying sound like something that you would find on a blog nowadays, even though this was written in 1776 or before that. And the reason I'm saying this is because there's a lot of discussion nowadays about how the GDP is maybe not the best way to measure the wealth, the true advancement of a country. And they say that conflating money or conflating money and real wealth is a mistake, or maybe not the best thing to do all of the time. Anyway, to continue. So he was saying that a rich country is supposed to be a country abounding in money. So this whole thing about the Spaniards is an example. So to continue, for some time after the discovery of America, the first inquiry of the Spaniards, when they arrived upon an unknown coast, used to be if there was any gold or silver to be found in the neighborhood. By the information which they received, they judged whether it was worthwhile to make a settlement there, or if the country was worth conquering. Plano Carpino, a monk, sent an ambassador from the King of France to one of the sons of the famous Genghis Khan. Sorry. He didn't send an ambassador. He was an ambassador. So Plano Carpino, a monk, who was sent as the ambassador by the King of France to one of the sons of the famous Genghis Khan, says that the Tartars used frequently to ask him if there was plenty of sheep and oxen in the kingdom of France. So that was like their money. That was their gold. Their inquiry had the same object with that of the Spaniards. They wanted to know if the country was rich enough to be worth the conquering. Among the Tartars, as among all other nations of the shepherds, who are generally ignorant of the use of money, cattle are the instruments of commerce and the measures of value. Wealth, therefore, according to them, consisted in cattle, as according to the Spaniards it consisted in gold and silver. Of the two, the Tartar notion, perhaps, was the nearest to the truth. So let me give an example, too. So these are two examples. And then the main idea is up at the top. So the main idea of that paragraph was that it's often supposed that, that if we're talking about the general usage of language, the way that people talk about countries is they say if they have a lot of gold or silver or a lot of sheep or oxen, then that is a rich country. That's what people mean when they say rich. So new paragraph. Mr. Locke remarks a distinction, so I think that's referring to, I don't remember his first name, I think it's John Locke. He's like a famous guy named Locke. I think he's a philosopher. But anyway, so Mr. Locke remarks a distinction between money and other movable goods. All other movable goods, he says, are of so consumable a nature that the wealth which consists in them cannot be much depended on. Let me pause there. Okay, I'm a little confused because he doesn't give an example, but I'll start again. Mr. Locke remarks a distinction between money and other movable goods. All other movable goods, he says, are of so consumable a nature that the wealth which consists in them cannot be much depended on, and a nation which abounds in them one year may, without any exportation, but merely their own waste and extravagance, be in great want of them the next. Oh, I see what he's saying. So what he's saying is that, so the thing about gold and silver, and the thing about sheep and oxen, is that you don't really consume them that much on their own. Like sheep and at least with sheep, you just kind of, I think you just consume their wool. You might, eat a couple of them, but you don't eat all of them, right? And with gold, the same thing, where you might use some of it to decorate your churches or to make jewelry, but you can pretty much depend that the amount of gold in the system is going to remain pretty stable over time. And what Mr. Locke is saying is that not all products are like that. Some products vary a lot with how much of them there are in the system. And so he's saying that basically that's one of the things that distinguishes money from other kinds of goods, is that the amount of it in the system stays relatively stable. And it's not likely to be totally used up and become, what's the word, scarce all of a sudden. So that's, so he says, money, on the contrary, is a steady friend, which, though it may travel about from hand to hand, yet if it can be kept from going out of the country, is not very liable to be wasted and consumed. Gold and silver, therefore, are, according to him, Mr. Locke, the most solid and substantial part of the movable wealth of a nation, and to multiply those metals ought, he thinks, upon that account, to be the greatest object of its political economy. Okay, so I'm going to put a main idea. I think this whole first bit is the main idea. And then kind of has, so he has the first main idea of that paragraph is explaining the idea that there's a difference between gold and silver and other movable goods, and then the second main idea is that because of that difference, the nation ought to try to multiply the presence of those special money metals. Okay, new paragraph. There's no way I'm going to get anywhere close to the end of this chapter. Slow going. Others admit, so this is a new paragraph, so others, aside from Mr. Locke, admit that if a nation could be separated from all the world, it would be of no consequence how much or how little money circulated in it. The consumable goods which were circulated by means of this money would only be exchanged for a greater or a smaller number of pieces. But the real wealth or poverty of the country, they allow, would depend altogether upon the abundance or scarcity of those consumable goods. But it is otherwise, they think, with countries which have connections with foreign nations, and which are obliged to carry on foreign wars, and to maintain fleets and armies in distant countries. This, they say, cannot be done but by sending abroad money to pay them with. And a nation cannot send much money abroad unless it has a good deal at home. Every such nation, therefore, must endeavor in time of peace to accumulate gold and silver that, when occasion requires, it may have wherewithal to carry on foreign wars. That's a very interesting idea. Very interesting idea. That's why I love this book, because there are a lot of ideas in this book that I have never heard before that just are very, very interesting. It's a really interesting idea. Okay, anyway, new paragraph. It's a really good idea. New paragraph. In consequence of these popular notions, all the different nations of Europe have studied, though to little purpose, every possible means of accumulating gold and silver in their respective countries. Spain and Portugal, the proprietors of the principal mines which supply Europe with those metals, have either prohibited their exportation under the severest penalties, or subjected it to a considerable duty. The like prohibition seems anciently to have made a part of the policy of most other European nations. So I think what he's saying is that this kind of prohibition has been a policy in lots of other countries in Europe. The like prohibition seems anciently to have made a part of the policy of most other European nations. It is even to be found where we should least of all expect to find it, in some old Scotch Acts of Parliament, which forbid under heavy penalties the carrying gold or silver forth of the kingdom. I don't know why we should least of all expect to find it in Scotland. So I'll put a question mark there, because he's obviously referencing something, some kind of common knowledge that I don't know, I don't have. Okay, so next paragraph. Well, I'll just make a mark the main idea. Okay, so new paragraph. When those countries became commercial, the merchants found this prohibition upon many occasions extremely inconvenient. They could frequently buy more advantageously with gold and silver than with any other commodity the foreign goods which they wanted, either to import into their own, or to carry to some other foreign country. They remonstrated, therefore, against this prohibition as hurtful to trade. So the merchants were complaining that having this prohibition was hurting trade. So new paragraph. They represented first, so the merchants said first, that the exportation of gold and silver in order to purchase foreign goods did not always diminish the quantity of those metals in the kingdom. That, on the contrary, it might frequently increase that quantity, because if the consumption of foreign goods was not thereby increased in the country, those goods might be exported to foreign countries, and being there sold for a large profit, might bring back much more treasure than was originally sent out to purchase them. Let me make sure I understand that. They represented first that the exportation of gold and silver in order to purchase foreign goods, so you send the gold out to have the foreign goods come in, did not always diminish the quantity of those metals in the kingdom. That, on the contrary, it might frequently increase that quantity, because if the consumption of foreign goods was not thereby increased in the country, those goods might be re-exported to foreign countries. Oh, and being there sold for a large profit might bring back much more treasure than was originally sent out to purchase them. So basically what they're saying is, the merchants are saying, we can be like a middleman, we can be a reseller. So we buy, say, dresses from China, silk clothing from China, and we pay China 1 gold piece per dress, and then we give China 1 gold piece per dress, and we get the dresses, and then we go to, I don't know, Morocco or Egypt or the United States, and we resell those same silk dresses to the United States, and we get 2 gold pieces. And so we end up getting even more gold than we had before. So that's the first thing that they're saying. So I'll write that in here. So I'm writing in this example that I just thought of. Okay. So this same paragraph, Mr. Mun, don't know who that is. I'll circle these names. So these are obviously people that were maybe referenced earlier in the book or were well known to the readers. So Mr. Mun compares this operation of foreign trade to the seed time and harvest of agriculture. Okay, so and there's a quote, "If we only behold," says he, "the actions of the husbandman in the seed time, when he casteth away much good corn into the ground, we shall account him rather a madman than a husbandman. But when we consider his labors in the harvest, which is the end of his endeavors, we shall find the worth and plentiful increase of his action." End quote. That's a really good analogy. So it's the same thing with the gold. So basically he's using it as an analogy for why it can be good to send gold out of the country. So new paragraph. They represented secondly, so the merchants said secondly, that this prohibition could not hinder the exportation of gold and silver, which, on account of the smallness of their bulk in proportion to their value, could easily be smuggled abroad. That this exportation could only be prevented by a proper attention to what they called the balance. The merchants said that this exportation could only be prevented by a proper attention to what they called the balance of trade. That when the country exported to a greater value than it imported, a balance became due to it from foreign nations, which was necessarily paid to it in gold and silver, and thereby increased the quantity of those metals in the kingdom. But that when it imported to a greater value than it exported, a contrary balance became due to foreign nations, which was necessarily paid to them in the same manner, and thereby diminished that quantity. That in this case to prohibit the exportation of those metals could not prevent it, but only by making it more dangerous, render it more expensive. Let me pause there. Oh, okay. I understand what he's saying. So let me read that. I'll start in the previous sentence. But that when a nation imported to a greater value than it exported, a contrary balance became due to foreign nations, which was necessarily paid to them in the same manner with gold, and thereby diminished that quantity of gold. And the merchants said that in this case, to prohibit, so in the case in which you owe these foreign nations gold, to prohibit the exportation of those metals could not prevent it. It could not prevent the exportation. The prohibition could not prevent the exportation. But only, so in other words, all this would do is by making it, it would make it more dangerous. And that would make it more expensive to move, or meaning it would be more of like a profit. There would be more profit in moving it. In other words, let me read it again. I'll read it without explanatory comments. That in this case to prohibit the exportation of those metals could not prevent it, but only by making it more dangerous, render it more expensive. So this is exactly what they're saying about the drug trade nowadays. That the exchange was thereby turned more against the country which owed the balance than it otherwise might have been. The merchant who purchased a bill upon the foreign country, being obliged to pay the banker who sold it, not only for the natural risk, trouble, and expense of sending the money thither, but for the extraordinary risk arising from the prohibition, but that the more the exchange was against any country, the more the balance of trade became necessarily against it. I'm not sure I understand these sentences. But that the more the exchange was against any country, the more the balance of trade became necessarily against it, the money of that country becoming necessarily of so much less value in comparison with that of the country to which the balance was due. Okay, and he gives an example. And they were saying that if the exchange between England and Holland, for example, was 5% against England, it would require 105 ounces of silver in England to purchase a bill for 100 ounces of silver in Holland. And that 105 ounces of silver in England, therefore, would be worth only 100 ounces of silver in Holland, and would purchase only a proportionable quantity of Dutch goods. But that 100 ounces of silver in Holland, on the other hand, on the contrary, would be worth 105 ounces in England, and would purchase a proportionable quantity of English goods. That the English goods which were sold to Holland would be sold so much cheaper, and the Dutch goods which were sold to England so much dearer by the difference of the exchange. That the one would draw so much less Dutch money to England, and the other so much more English money to Holland, as this difference amounted to, and that the balance of trade, therefore, would necessarily be so much more against England, and would require a greater balance of gold and silver to be exported to Holland. Oh man, I think I understand what he's saying. Okay, that was a long paragraph. So the first thing I would note is that he introduces the term balance of trade. He might say it earlier in the book, but I'm just kind of skipping to this chapter. Okay, so I think the main point he's trying to make in that paragraph, or the main point that was being made by the merchants, is that if you restrict the ability of the merchants to send money abroad, you raise the cost for them to do business. You're not going to prevent them from doing it. You're just going to raise the cost. And that ends up screwing your country over, because then they're basically doing their jobs with one arm tied behind their back, and it makes it more expensive for them to buy foreign goods. So, if, for example, I think he gives the example here that, yeah, that basically it would basically make it easier for people in Holland to buy things and more difficult for people in England to buy things. And I think that's what the 105 ounces and the 100 ounces of gold example was all about. Yeah, I think that's what that's talking about. So I'm going to write this out. So the main idea. All right, I'm not totally sure. Okay, next paragraph. Okay, so next paragraph. Those arguments were partly solid and partly sophistical. Okay, so in the previous paragraph he was giving the arguments of the merchants, and now he is giving his own opinion. He's saying that they had a point, some of what they were saying was right, and other parts were kind of maybe not right, and more clever arguments that maybe not right. So he says, they were solid so far as they asserted that the exportation of gold and silver in trade might frequently be advantageous to the country. They were solid, too, in asserting that no prohibition could prevent their exportation when private people found any advantage in exporting them. But they were sophistical in supporting, so sophistical means wrong, or It means kind of the same way that a lawyer could make an argument that sounds right, but is really not right. Um, but they were sophistical in supposing that either to preserve or to augment the quantity of those metals required more the attention of government than to preserve or augment the quantity of any other useful commodities, which the freedom of trade, without any such attention, never fails to supply in the proper quantity. They were sophistical too, perhaps, in asserting that the high price of exchange necessarily increased what they called the unfavorable balance of trade, or occasioned the exportation of a greater quantity of gold and silver. I think that is the exact thing that I was confused about when I was reading the previous paragraph. I didn't see the necessary connection there, because what the previous paragraph seemed to be saying is that when you make it more expensive for people to send their gold abroad, that somehow makes it more expensive, makes it the balance of trade more, it makes them send more gold to Holland. And I wasn't sure if I was convinced about that, because if English goods become cheaper, then they become more competitive. And that's something that we see nowadays with China. They're purposely keeping the value of their money down so that they remain competitive in the global economy. So he continues. Okay, so they were sophistical too, perhaps, in asserting that the high price of exchange necessarily increased what they called the unfavorable balance of trade, or occasioned the exportation of a greater quantity of gold and silver. That high price, indeed, was extremely disadvantageous to the merchants who had any money to pay in foreign countries. They paid so much dearer for the bills which their bankers granted them upon those countries. But though the risk arising from the prohibition might occasion some extraordinary expense to the bankers, it would not necessarily carry any more money out of the country. This expense would generally be laid out, this expense would generally be all laid out in the country, in smuggling the money out of it, and could seldom occasion the exportation of a single sixpence beyond the precise sum drawn for. The high price of exchange, too, would naturally dispose the merchants to endeavor to make their exports nearly balance their imports, in order that they might have this high exchange. The high price of exchange, too, would naturally dispose the merchants to endeavor to make their exports nearly balance their imports, in order that they might have this high exchange to pay upon a small sum as possible. Oh, okay. That's a weird sentence to understand, but I think I know what he's saying. So I think what he's saying is, if they make their imports balance their exports, then they don't get hit by the exchange, the cost of moving money. I think that's what he's saying, is if you end up with money in Holland that should be in England, you have to pay to move it to England. If you end up with money in England that should be in Holland, you have to pay to move it there. And so they try to balance their imports and their exports so they don't have to do that. The high price of exchange, besides, must necessarily have operated as a tax in raising the price of foreign goods, and thereby diminishing their consumption. It would tend, therefore, not to increase, but to diminish what they called the unfavorable balance of trade, and consequently the exportation of gold and silver. So that's the end of that paragraph. It's another long paragraph, and I would describe this as Adam Smith responds to the merchants whose opinions were laid out in the previous paragraph. Okay. I'm pretty tired. 2:30. I think I'm going to pause here because I'm not totally focused. But this was fun. I like this book. But it's dense stuff. You got to focus to understand what he's saying, because there's a lot of context that we don't have, since this was written so long ago, and it can be hard to understand exactly what it means unless you focus and think about it. Okay, so that's it for tonight.